Hi, I'd like to talk to you today about G-Wave, which is a software synthesizer from the late 70s, early 80s. And although you probably haven't heard the name, at all, you probably have heard the sounds in arcade games of that era. So let's dive in. So, in the mid-1970s, microprocessors were all the rage. The little CPUs you get in home computers just a few years later. These were already starting to be used in things like arcade machines of the era, and one such company making those was Williams. They made pinball tables, and at the time, before microprocessors, these were all electromechanical, meaning they had a whole rat's nest of wires inside them. Technology Connections has a great video about that. So all of that logic of all the what scores points in which context, once you replace all of that with a few chips, it became much easier to rapidly prototype such machines. You could add in features at the drop of a hat, much easier, much cheaper to build everything. It was very good at replacing all the logic side of that. But I'm more interested usually in the kind of sound side of things. So let's look at how electromechanical pinball tables, very briefly, made their sounds. They pretty much had a xylophone or glockenspiel in them. These little metal bits that you strike with a solenoid, so it's automated electrically. So at the appropriate time, it would just make a little motion like that would strike the little bar, and it would be ding 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 ding, and that's how it made it sound. So it's a very kind of limited palette. Whereas once these CPUs, the microprocessors, came along, they started using those for sounds as well, and you got some really interesting kind of gastronomical bubbly sounds out of them, like and at the same time pinball machines like Flash by Williams in the late 70s, that introduced this whole ratcheting effect, where there'd be this background in playing just constantly while you're playing a game. In the background there'd be this drone like, and the more points you scored, it kind of ratcheted it up a bit, so it'd be like the pitch raise to show how well you were doing. So anyone within earshot in the vicinity in the arcade, they could hear someone's playing really well, and they'd all know to like gather a crowd around and check out how they're doing with playing their game. So that became Flash, and that became, I think, the most popular pinball machine by Williams at that point, not just out of the solid state ones, but out of all of them. So this was quite a big step up. And that's the machine that inspired Eugene Jarvis to come and work for Williams. The way most companies did this kind of thing, say Atari a few years later, they released the Pokey chip for the potentiometer and keyboard reading, which could generate a few square waves and white noise, and you just tell it, play this note now, stop playing this note, it's at this frequency, it should be a square wave, go, and it will do all the working out for you of how to actually make a square wave. And so it had a few channels of square waves. It wasn't amazing, but at least it offloaded some of the power involved of synthesizing, so you didn't have to focus on that in your software. Then you had like the SID chip by MOS, the 6581. That was a great chip. It has 3 channels, various different waveforms. It had a filter and it even had ring mod. It was basically a proper synthesizer in a chip, and the Commodore 64, especially in the UK, in the Midlands, musicians were making really good music on it. In my opinion, much better than what was in the arcades. And then you had Yamaha with their DX range of FM synthesis keyboards based on John Chowning's work. Those ended up being used in chip form in things like the Sega Mega Drive. But before any of that, it transpired that to make all these sounds, what they've done is, just as they had a Motorola 6800 chip used as a CPU to control the logic, they had another one just for the sound. And minor kind of intermediate bits aside, they basically wire that directly up to a DAC, an 8-bit DAC, so the CPU, you could get to spit out numbers between 0 and 255, and that will be sent straight to a DAC that turns it into a voltage between 2 extremes, and that will just be hooked up to a speaker. So that will just move into one of 256 positions between 0 and 255. So in effect, you could make any sound, any waveform you wanted, just by moving the speaker to exact positions, set speed. And so you can make any sound you want, but you need to tell it how to do so with instructions you make in software. And you've only got 2 kilobytes of ROM to play with, and for RAM you've got 128 bytes, not gigabytes or megabytes or kilobytes, but 128 bytes. So 128 numbers, each of which can be between 0 and 255. That's all the memory you've got to hold in memory all of the let's see, the priority list of everything. You've got to work out if you're supposed to play lots of sounds at once, but you can only play one sound at a time. You've got to have all this logic to work out which sound takes priority, and you've got to remember the lower priority sounds, where those are up to, so you can then return back to them once the higher priority sound's finished. All that kind of stuff in 2K of ROM, 128 bytes of RAM. That's not enough RAM to even have a full cycle of a waveform, I'm pretty sure, if you wanted to do it at any decent resolution. So befitting of 0 to 255, like 8-bit sample depth. But anyway, those are pretty limiting constraints, and yet within that, that system that Randy Pfeiffer had built, Eugene Jarvis, tempted to Chicago by Flash, he wrote this software synthesizer that took advantage of that hardware that he called G-Wave. And you feed in G-Wave a bunch of parameters, just a few numbers, and based on that it will generate all these kind of weird and wacky primitive waveforms. So it's kind of fairly basic but still heavily modulated synthesis, where it do things like pulse width modulation and stuff like that. And so it's kind of comparable to these in a very kind of cut down, simplified way, but still, that's, considering what they're working with here, that is really impressive that they managed to get that much out of it. So then they released pinball machines like Firepower, which had a similar ratcheting thing, but with more interesting sounds, like wah, 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 wah. And so you can really tell with that thing when someone's doing well, because it's not subtle about it. These are very kind of out there, loud, obnoxious in a fun way kind of sounds. And so G-Wave ended up being very popular, and not only was it used in the pinball machines, but they also used it in the video game arcade machines such as Joust and Defender, and not even just the engine but also some of the sounds in particular. For instance, in Firepower there's that game over sound, like that's the kind of sound it makes when you lose all your balls and it's game over. So they took that sound and used it in Defender, for example, as the level complete sound. When an attack wave finishes, that's the sound it makes there as well. And it's such an interesting sound, just, as are all the others, but this one as an example, such an interesting sound that Aphex Twin played Defender, and he sampled it and ended up using it in Bucephalus Bouncing Ball off of the Come to Daddy EP. And it's just, I think it really shows how you can make such interesting sounds with such primitive constraints that they're even worth sampling into electronic music decades later. So I thought that was kind of interesting and maybe kind of inspiring, because if we're talking about making sounds using such primitive means, pretty much anyone could say learn a bit of something like Python, or even I would do it in ANSI, I think, because you could just output raw PCM values. You don't even need a header for that. Import it into your sampler, find out what sounds good, and use it in the context of some electronic music. So you can make interesting sounds even with limited constraints, I think, is what I would choose as the take-home message from this. But I just thought it was kind of interesting how how these things kind of came about and what happens. Most companies, they would make a dedicated chip where you say, I want to play this note, this kind of waveform, start now, finish now, and it would take care of it for you. Williams went the complete opposite route and were like, okay, we're going to hand draw the waveform. We're going to tell the speaker, move here, move here, move here, move here, and we're going to tell it exactly how to draw the waveform, which is a very simple way of doing it hardware-wise, but just the audacity of making a real-time software synthesizer in the late 70s and then improving it in like the early 80s. I mean, that's kind of ahead of its time. I think back then any software synthesizers you would have been on the mainframes, like the predecessor to C Sounds, the Music one, I think it is, and let's see, the stuff John Chowning was doing, that would have been on mainframes at the time, and there was that record that came out that Radiohead then sampled for Idiotech. And then, you know, Radiohead on the top of that, they're like... Anyway, that one. That was like an obscure record on vinyl. It was not generated in real time. Really, people were not aware of these kinds of things at the time. So in that context, to be making all these real-time sounds that reacted to all the stuff he did on pinball machines and arcade games, I thought that was, you know, really quite the thing they were doing back then. So, you know, my hat's off to them that they managed to get so much out of 2 kilobytes and 128 bytes and an 8-bit DAC. It's literally just a stream of numbers between 0 and 255, and from that they made all these weird and mucky sounds worth sampling decades later. I thought that was kind of neat. So thank you very much for listening to me ramble about clearly what I've been hyperfixating on the last week or two. If you're sponsoring this, thank you very much indeed. Otherwise, please like, share and subscribe. You know, if you forget to do those things, it's fine. We're all only human, aren't we? We're trying our best. So thank you very much and see you next time. Bye.